Some names and details in this story have been changed for the purpose of anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photos were taken at the scene. On July 10th, 2014, Ella Reynolds and Hector Bell entered Glacier National Park on their way to the remote Lake Kintla. It was the last time they were seen alive. A week-long vacation turned into a year of suspense when a large-scale search operation failed to find any trace of the two young men, who seemed to have disappeared into the dense forest. Only on July 12th, 2015, did the forest reluctantly reveal its terrible secret. In the thick of the forest, where no tourist had ever set foot, an old rusty refrigerator wrapped in a heavy chain was found. What was inside made even experienced detectives shudder and turned the case of the disappearance into a hunt for a cold-blooded killer. The morning of July 10th, 2014, in Kalispell, Montana, was surprisingly clear. The sun was just beginning to rise above the sharp peaks of the ranges, illuminating the streets that had not yet warmed up from the summer heat. 30-year-old Ella Reynolds and her friend Hector Bell left their hotel room at exactly 8 o'clock 45 minutes. They looked like a typical couple who had finally gotten their long-awaited vacation, smiling, energetic, and loaded with gear. Their goal was the northwestern corner of Glacier National Park, a remote and wild area of Lake Kintla rarely reached by casual tourists. At 9 o'clock and 30 minutes in the morning, their silver Toyota RAV4 pulled into the parking lot of the Hangry Bear Diner, a roadside establishment located near the town of Columbia Falls. It was their first stop on the route. The waitress, Samantha Miller, who served their table by the window, remembered the couple quite clearly. In her statement to the police, she later noted that the young men ordered a large portion of blueberry pancakes and a bacon omelet. They drank black coffee and laughed a lot, discussing their upcoming days in the woods. A detailed topographic map of Glacier Park was laid out on the table between the plates. Samantha recalled Hector tracing his finger along the winding line of the road leading to the lake. According to the witness, the man looked a little worried. He repeatedly asked Ella about the condition of the dirt road at the entrance to the campsite, commenting that their car was quite loaded. Ella, on the other hand, radiated calmness and confidence, joking that they would make it through any obstacle. This breakfast lasted 45 minutes. After leaving the cafe, the couple did not immediately head for the entrance to the park. At 11 o'clock, 45 minutes, their car pulled into the North Valley Auto Repair Shop. Hector was worried about a strange, rhythmic whistle coming from under the hood as they were picking up speed. The mechanic on duty, Michael Thornton, immediately inspected the vehicle. He checked the drive belt tension and the coolant level. The investigator's report would later state that the problem was minor. A metal clamp on the cooling system's spigot had loosened, creating a distinctive vibration sound. Michael tightened the clamp with a regular wrench. The entire repair took no more than 15 minutes. The service's outdoor surveillance cameras captured the moment. A grainy image shows Ella buying a bottle of mineral water from a street vending machine while Hector pays the mechanic in cash. At 10 o'clock 60 minutes, the video shows the car slowly driving onto the main highway and turning toward North Fork Road. This was Ella and Hector's last documented contact with civilization. According to the plan they left with their relatives, the couple was supposed to return home on the evening of July 17th. When the Toyota did not show up at Ella's parents' house at the appointed time, and both young people's cell phones kept redirecting calls to voicemail, the family began to worry. After a day of unsuccessful attempts to contact the children, on July 18, Ella's father filed an official missing persons report with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. The response from law enforcement was immediate, given the harsh wilderness conditions of Glacier Park. That same day, rangers began checking the campgrounds. 4 hours later, the patrol spotted a silver Toyota in a small gravel parking lot near Kintla Lake. The car was parked neatly in the shade of old pine trees. The doors were locked. Inspection of the interior through the glass gave the investigators the first alarming information. There were wallets with driver's licenses and cash on the front seat, and 2 cell phones in the center console. This clearly indicated that Ella and Hector did not plan to return to civilization in the near future and went on a hiking trip, leaving their extra belongings in the car. However, their names were not in the hiker's logbook at the beginning of the trail. On July 19th, a large-scale search and rescue operation was launched. The coordination headquarters was set up right on the shore of the lake. More than 60 people took part in the search. Professional rescuers, park rangers, volunteers from local communities, and dog handlers. A border guard helicopter equipped with a thermal imager was sent into the sky, although the dense tree canopy made it difficult to see from the air. The area around Lake Kintla was characterized by a difficult terrain: dense coniferous forests, steep slopes, and numerous ravines overgrown with bushes. The K-9 team with 2 bloodhounds started from the car. The dogs confidently picked up the trail that led from the parking lot along the northern shore of the lake. The group moved slowly, carefully checking every bush and every ledge. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from the water. The rescuers walked 4 miles along a narrow, barely visible animal trail. The hope of finding the tourists alive was high. The weather was warm, and experienced hikers could stay in the forest for several days. But near a wide, rocky bed of a dried-up stream, the dogs suddenly stopped. They circled in place, whining, but refused to go any further. The trail broke off instantly and completely, as if the tourists had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. Over the next week, search teams combed square after square within a 10-mile radius of the trail's loss. They turned over stones, examined depressions under tree roots, and checked the bottom of nearby water bodies. Not a single energy bar wrapper, not a single lost piece of equipment, not a single trace of a fire was found. The forest was absolutely clean. The forensic experts who examined the car found no signs of a struggle or the presence of unauthorized persons. Fingerprints on the steering wheel and door handles belonged only to Ellie and Hector. There was fuel in the tank, and the technical condition of the car was satisfactory. The version that they could have gotten lost looked less and less convincing to experienced rangers. Usually, people who get lost leave traces, broken branches, slip marks on the slopes, scattered things to attract attention. Here, however, there was a perfect, unnatural silence. On July 25th, after 7 days of intensive but fruitless searching, the active phase of the operation was curtailed. The parents of the disappeared refused to believe that their children were gone, but the facts were inexorable. The case of Ella Reynolds and Hector Bell was officially reclassified as a disappearance under unexplained circumstances. Folders of documents were placed on a shelf in the sheriff's office, and photos of the smiling couple against the backdrop of mountains began to slowly fade on the wanted bulletin board. None of the detectives then realized that the answer to their questions was much closer than they thought, but hidden so securely that it could only be found through pure, horrific accident. Exactly 1 year has passed since the day when the young couple's footsteps broke off on a rocky bank. The forest was silent, reliably hiding its secrets under a thick cover of pine needles and ferns. On July 12, 2015, the silence of the protected area was broken by the Peterson family from Idaho. Mark, his wife Linda, and their 10-year-old son Noah came to the park in search of solitude. They deliberately ignored popular tourist routes in an effort to find a wild place for a family picnic and landscape photos in the Whitefish Mountain Range area. The family left their pickup truck on a remote dirt road at around 10 o'clock in the morning. Armed with only light backpacks and a camera, they went deep into the forest. The terrain here was difficult. Storms alternated with dense brush, and steep ravines forced them to constantly change direction. The Petersons went about 5 miles away from the nearest road, finding themselves in an area where there was no mobile communication. Around 2 in the afternoon, 10-year-old Noah, who was running ahead of his parents, suddenly stopped. The boy noticed something unnatural in the midst of the dense green forest. Through the dense wall of young spruce trees and tall ferns, a strange white object peeked through. Its geometrically regular shapes contrasted sharply with the chaotic lines of the wilderness. It did not resemble the ruins of an old hunting hut or a spontaneous garbage dump. There was an untouched virgin forest around it. As Mark and Linda approached, they were stunned. In front of them, standing upright among the centuries-old trees, was a massive household refrigerator. It was an old model of the Frostguard brand, popular in the 70s of the last century. The picture looked absolutely surreal. The enamel of the appliance had faded and was covered with rust in places, resembling dried wounds. Moss had already begun to grow on top of the case, indicating that the object had been here for months. However, it was not the presence of household appliances in the middle of nowhere that caused the most concern, but one detail. The refrigerator was tightly wrapped in a thick steel chain. The links of the chain were tightly embedded in the metal of the case, and the ends were connected by a heavy barn lock covered with a layer of corrosion. There was no sign of a foundation, walls, or road around it. Someone had brought this object here deliberately, with a titanic effort. Mark Peterson took a few more steps forward and suddenly stopped. The wind changed direction, and the man smelled a specific, sickening odor. It was a heavy, sweetish stench of decomposition that could not be confused with the smell of a dead animal. Mark sharply ordered his son and wife to stand back. Without approaching the object closely, he took out his pocket navigator and recorded the exact coordinates of the find. The family immediately turned around and started walking in the opposite direction. 4 hours later, at 18 hours and 30 minutes, a group of rangers accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the site. It was extremely difficult to get to the point, as they had to cut their way through the brush. When the group reached the clearing with the refrigerator, the sun was already sinking, casting long shadows on the rusty metal of the frost guard. Officer James Holden, who was leading the group, later described the moment in a report as the most disturbing silence he had ever heard. The forest around them seemed to have died out. After inspecting the castle, the rangers realized that there was no way to find the key. One of the assistants took a bolt cutter out of his backpack. With a loud metal ringing that echoed through the forest, the chain links were cut. The chain fell to the forest floor with a crash. Holden put on his gloves and pulled the door handle. The rubber seal was stuck from time and heat, so the door did not give way immediately. When the seal was broken, the smell became unbearable, forcing those present to cover their faces with respirators. A flashlight beam snatched the horrific contents from the darkness of the chamber. Inside, twisted in an unnatural fetal position, was the mummified body of a human being. The skin had dried and darkened, the clothes had turned into rags, but it was possible to identify the deceased. He was wearing the remains of hiking equipment that matched the description of Hector Bell, who disappeared a year ago. The body was literally crammed into the limited space of the refrigerator, with limbs unnaturally twisted, indicating that it had been placed there after the onset of rigor mortis, or brute force, had been used. The forensic scientists who arrived later thoroughly examined every inch of space inside and outside the frost guard. They checked the freezer and sifted the soil around the facility within a 50-yard radius. But one detail made the discovery even more terrifying than the fact of the murder. There was only one body in the refrigerator. Hector Bell was dead, but there was no sign of Ella Reynolds. The refrigerator had become a coffin for one man, leaving the fate of the other a sinister mystery, the answer to which may still be wandering somewhere in the woods. Friends, before we continue to dive into this tangled story, I have a small favor to ask of you. Please subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, and like this video. I would also be grateful for any comments below the video. It's not just a formality, it's your activity that signals YouTube's algorithms to promote this content. Thanks to your support, many more people will be able to learn about this mysterious case, and this is the best motivation for me to continue working on such investigations. Thank you. And now back to the events in Montana. The body, found in a metal trap in the middle of the forest, was brought to the office of the state's chief medical examiner in Missoula on July 14, 2015. The atmosphere in the morgue was tense. What began as a search for missing tourists had finally turned into a brutal murder investigation. The pathologists worked on Hector Bell's body for more than 6 hours, trying to make the mute witnesses, the bones and tissue remains, tell the story of the last moments of the young architect's life. The official autopsy report dispelled any hopes of an accident. The examination showed that the death was not caused by hypothermia or dehydration. The victim's skull had characteristic injuries in the occipital region. A depressed fracture indicated a strong, accentuated blow with a blunt, heavy object. The angle of the blow indicated that the attacker probably sneaked up behind him and acted by surprise. However, the blow only stunned Hector. The immediate cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation. The hyoid bone was broken, which is an indisputable sign of strangulation. Someone killed the helpless victim in cold blood by tightening the noose around his neck. But the most surprising findings awaited the investigators not in the injuries, but in the victim's clothes. Forensic analysis of Hector's jacket, which had miraculously survived in the hermetic environment of the refrigerator, revealed microscopic particles of substances that were completely alien to the ecosystem of Glacier Park. Firstly, traces of red clay with a high content of iron oxide were found in the fibers of the fabric. The geologists involved in the consultations categorically stated that the soil in the area of Lake Kintla and the Whitefish Range has a completely different chemical composition and color. The red clay is found much further east, in industrial quarries or construction sites in the valley. This meant that the murder, or at least the body's contact with the ground, occurred tens of miles from the discovery site, after which the body was transported deep into the forest. Secondly, spectral analysis revealed tiny fragments of automotive enamel of a specific shade of metallic blue on the sleeve of the jacket. It was not a paint of modern factory standards. The chemical composition pointed to old coating samples used in the automotive industry in the 80s or 90s. This microscopic detail gave the investigation a concrete clue. The killer probably used an old blue car to transport the body. The logistics of the crime were striking in their complexity. The detectives who examined the scene concluded that it was almost impossible to deliver a heavy refrigerator into such a dense area without using heavy machinery. However, there were no traces of tractor or ATV treads on the forest floor, even after a year. Investigators put forward a version that the perpetrator used a special handcart with wide wheels or a sled in the winter, exerting inhuman physical effort. This characterized him as a person with exceptional physical strength and knowledge of the area. But the real shock was caused by the discovery made directly inside the frost guard cell. When the experts carefully lifted the body, they found a crumpled chewing gum wrapper lying underneath, in a corner of the rusty metal bottom. It was a small piece of foil paper that might have looked like garbage, but for one detail. The markings on the wrapper indicated a brand that was sold exclusively in the local gas station chain Mountain Stop. The detectives contacted the company's distributor and used the batch number printed on the edge of the wrapper to trace the supply chain. The distributor's response came as a bolt from the blue. This particular batch of chewing gum had only gone on sale on August 15, 2014. The math was terrible and simple. Ella and Hector had disappeared on July 10th. The chewing gum, whose wrapper was found under the body in the locked refrigerator, was manufactured and sold at least a month after their disappearance. This fact completely destroyed the original chronology of events. This discovery gave rise to two equally chilling scenarios. First, Hector Bell was alive much longer than the police believed, and was held captive somewhere where he had access to this gum before being killed and hidden in the woods. The second, even more cynical option, is that the killer returned to the crime scene a month or even later. He opened the refrigerator, perhaps to check on the body or to mock the victim, and accidentally dropped the wrapper inside before relocking it. The case was immediately reclassified as aggravated murder. Harrison Ford, the lead detective of the criminal division, took over the investigation. He was an experienced officer with 20 years of experience, known for his meticulousness and tenacity. He understood that they were not dealing with a random robbery, but with the actions of a calculating, organized predator. Ford ordered every inch of the woods around the site to be rechecked, looking for any wheel or shoe tracks that might have been missed during the first inspection. The discovery of the wrapper changed everything. Investigators now knew the perpetrator hadn't just killed and fled. He was coming back. This meant that he felt at home in the woods, not afraid to be seen, and probably continued to monitor the search from very close by. The atmosphere in the Flathead County Sheriff's Office, where the walls were lined with detailed maps of the area and crime scene photos, was heavy. Detective Harrison Ford realized that they were not dealing with a random killer who had succumbed to a momentary flash of rage. The nature of the crime, the way the body was hidden, and the maniacal attention to detail indicated that a calculating and dangerous predator was operating in the Montana woods. A profiler from the Federal Bureau of Investigation was involved in the investigation, and based on the available evidence, he created a detailed psychological profile of the offender. According to the profiler's report, the killer was a local resident, a man between the ages of 35 and 50. He knew the forest perfectly, navigated the intricate network of old logging roads and trails that are not on official tourist maps. This man certainly had the physical strength necessary to transport the body and the massive refrigerator deep into the thicket. He was a loner, prone to isolation, and likely had access to old equipment, storage facilities, or equipment dumps. The use of the refrigerator as an improvised coffin was indicative of a certain cynicism and perhaps a desire to preserve his trophy, or simply a pragmatic use of the means of disposal at hand. The key element that allowed us to narrow the geography of the search was the red clay found on Hector Bell's jacket. Laboratory analysis of the soil samples gave an unequivocal result. It was not ordinary forest soil. The high content of iron oxide and specific mineral impurities pointed to a specific geological zone. Geologists confirmed that this type of soil was only found in the eastern part of the county, in the area of old industrial quarries where minerals had been mined for decades. This location was 40 miles from Lake Kintla. The conclusion was obvious. The killer lived or worked in the area of these quarries. The murder took place there, and he drove the body back into the forest to cover his tracks. With this link to the area, Detective Ford ordered an extensive vehicle search to begin. Investigators were looking for a car painted in an old-style blue metallic, whose owner lived within 50 miles of the quarries. The task was complicated by the fact that the description included thousands of old pickup trucks and SUVs that dotted the rural state. The police filtered the database, focusing on men who had priors for violent crimes, assault, illegal weapons possession, or poaching. The list of potential suspects was reduced slowly, requiring alibi checks for each person as of July 2014. In parallel with the work on the database, a group of technical specialists tried to find visual evidence of the criminal's movements. The police seized hard drives from CCTV cameras at all gas stations, shops, and private homes along the road, leading from the eastern quarries to the western part of the park. The detectives hoped to see a car with a trailer or a van transporting a refrigerator. However, time played against the investigation. A whole year had passed since the crime. Most video surveillance systems automatically overwrite the data every 30 or 60 days. Terabytes of information were lost forever, turning into digital noise. However, where technology was powerless, human memory came to the rescue. While interviewing forestry workers who served the Whitefish Ridge area, the detectives came across a forester named Thomas Harding. The man, who had worked in these forests for more than 20 years, initially did not pay much attention to the police's questions. But when it came to unusual activity in the forest last fall, he recalled a strange episode. In his testimony, Harding said that, at the end of September 2014, during a routine walkthrough of the area after heavy rains, he noticed strange tracks on a washed-out dirt road that had not been used for vehicles for a long time. They were deep furrows, as if someone had dragged something extremely heavy and flat right through the mud without using wheels. The tracks led from the old clearing deep into the dense forest. The forester admitted that he did not check where these furrows led at the time. At that time, poachers were often active in the forest, and Harding decided that one of them was dragging a carcass of a dead elk or bear to load it into a car away from the main roads. He just made a note in his journal about possible poaching activity and forgot about it. Now, by matching the date and location, Detective Ford realized that what the forester had mistaken for an animal carcass was actually a heavy metal box with Hector Bell's body inside. This information made it possible to establish the exact route the killer took to get to the burial site. He drove in from the side of abandoned logging roads, bypassing the park's official checkpoints. This once again confirmed the profile. The criminal knew about these hidden paths, which had not been used for decades and were overgrown with bushes. The search circle inexorably narrowed around the eastern quarries. The analysts overlaid a map of the residence of people with criminal records on the red clay distribution area. One name began to pop up in the reports more often than others. This person fit the profile almost perfectly. A recluse prone to aggression, who lived on the edge of civilization and wilderness in the exact area where the evidence pointed. The police were preparing to knock on the door of what they believed to be the beast that had turned the refrigerator into a crypt. The first and most obvious target for the investigative team was 55-year-old Silas Thorne, known locally as Red. His candidacy fit perfectly into the psychological profile compiled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents. Thorne was a classic example of a survivalist who deliberately withdrew from society. He lived in a makeshift bunker disguised as an old barn, located in close proximity to the eastern quarries, exactly where the soil had the same specific red hue as the clay on the clothes of the murdered Hector Bell. Silas's reputation was, to put it mildly, troubling. The sheriff's office archives contained more than 10 complaints against him over the past 5 years. Hikers and hunters repeatedly reported an aggressive man who threatened them with a gun, demanding that they leave the area he considered his property, even though it was legally public land. But the most compelling argument for Detective Ford was the suspect's vehicle. In Thorne's yard, under a tarpaulin shed, was an old, dark blue Ford pickup truck. The paint on it had peeled off in places, exposing rusty metal, which could well explain the presence of enamel particles on the victim's jacket. The detention operation was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the morning on August 15, 2015. Given the information about the suspect's possible possession of an arsenal of firearms, a special task force was involved in the raid. The assault was lightning fast. Stun grenades disoriented the bunker owner, and within 2 minutes, Silas Thorne was lying face down in the red dust of his yard, his hands clasped behind his back. While the suspect was being transported to the police station, forensic experts began searching the area. What they found in the bunker extension made even experienced officers hold their breath. The room resembled a serial killer's trophy cabinet. Dozens of women's clothes were lying on shelves and in cardboard boxes in the dim light of the lanterns. Investigators seized 5 tourist backpacks of different colors, a pile of women's jewelry, sunglasses, and worst of all, several driver's licenses in different names. In the corner was a box with old cell phones. It seemed like a puzzle had been solved. The cops were sure they had found the lair of a maniac who had been preying on tourists in Glacier Park for years, and Ella Reynolds was one of his many victims. Detective Ford looked at these things and was already mentally formulating the text of a statement to the press about solving the series of murders. The interrogation of Silas Thorne lasted 3 days. It was an exhausting marathon for both the suspect and the detectives. Ford put pressure on him, showing him photos of the things he had found, demanding that he confess where he had buried Ella's body. Thorne behaved erratically. He would withdraw into himself and remain silent for hours, then explode with aggression, shouting curses at the government and the police. He denied any involvement in the couple's disappearance, claiming that all the belongings were his by right of discovery. The euphoria of the investigation began to fade when the first analyst's reports on the seized property came in. A detailed study of the trophies showed a completely different, less bloody, but no less pathological picture. All the backpacks found were old, with holes and broken zippers. The jewelry turned out to be cheap plastic. The driver's licenses belonged to people who were either alive and had reported the loss of their documents 5 to 10 years ago, or had already died of natural causes. A psychiatrist invited for a consultation confirmed the diagnosis. Silas Thorne suffered from pathological hoarding, also known as Plushkin syndrome. For years, he had been hoarding everything he found on roadsides, trash cans at gas stations, and abandoned campsites. Women's clothes were only part of a giant pile of junk that he considered valuable property. The final blow to the investigation's version of events came when the alibi was checked. Detectives pulled up medical records from Kalispell County Hospital. The documents showed that on July 10, 2014, the day Ella and Hector disappeared, Silas Thorne was in the hospital's trauma unit. He had been admitted on July 7th with an open fracture of the tibia, which he had suffered as a result of a fall from the roof of his barn. The records of the nurses on duty and the x-rays left no doubt. That week, Red Silas was confined to a hospital bed, and his leg was in a stretching device. Physically, he was unable to kidnap two healthy young men or even walk to the toilet on his own. The red clay in his yard did match the samples on Hector's body, but this only proved that the killer, like Thorne, had been to the quarry area, not that it was Thorne himself. Detective Ford was forced to sign an order to release the suspect. Silas Thorne was released after being ticketed for illegal possession of an unregistered hunting rifle and having it confiscated. The investigation, which seemed to be over, was back to square one. The police had wasted precious time chasing a ghost created by a coincidence. But while the detectives were trying to recover from the failure, the cybersecurity department finished recovering data from Ella Reynolds' virtual cloud storage, and a new image appeared on the monitor screen, pointing to a completely different person. After the high-profile failure to arrest the reclusive Silas Thorne, the investigation team found itself in a difficult position. Time was running out, and the pressure from the press and the public was becoming unbearable. The case of the murder of Hector Bell and the disappearance of Ella Reynolds risked becoming another hang-up that would gather dust in the archives for years. However, at the end of August 2015, an unexpected breakthrough occurred where it was least expected in the digital space. Experts from the cybercrime department, who had been trying to crack the security of Ella's cloud storage for months, finally succeeded. It turned out that a minute before the girl's cell phone lost connection with the cell tower forever, the device managed to automatically synchronize and upload a single file to the server. It was a photo taken by accident, probably when the phone slipped out of her hands or when Ella tried to quickly capture something around her. The picture was blurry, smeared by camera movement. Only blurry spruce branches and a fragment of Hector's shoulder were visible in the foreground. But the detective's attention was drawn to the background. After digital processing and sharpening, the monitor showed the silhouette of a man standing behind the trees at a distance of about 50 feet. It was impossible to see his face, but the stranger's clothing was very specific. He was wearing a jacket with a camouflage pattern of Sitka Mountain, a rare and expensive brand of professional hunting equipment that only wealthy people could afford. This detail instantly weeded out most of the local vagrants and petty poachers. The police started looking among the local elite, people who had the money for expensive equipment and a passion for hunting. The trail led detectives to 35-year-old Bradley Cooper. He was the son of an influential landowner whose land bordered the national park in the eastern sector, near the red clay quarries. Bradley Cooper had a reputation as a golden boy with a dark side. He was known for his love of extreme tourism and big game hunting. Locals characterized him as an arrogant and hot-tempered man who often showed off his trophies in local bars. But the most important thing for the detectives was that Cooper's property declaration listed an old, bright blue Jeep Wrangler SUV made in the late 80s. A search warrant for the Cooper's luxury estate was obtained on September 2nd. This time, the police proceeded more cautiously than with Thorne, realizing that they were dealing with a family with the best lawyers in the state. When the detectives entered the Bradleys' spacious garage, they saw the same blue SUV. At first glance, the color matched the paint samples found on the victim's jacket. During the search of the house, investigators found a room that Bradley himself called a den. The walls were covered with deer and bear heads, and an impressive collection of hunting knives was kept in glass cases. However, the real shocker was the discovery on the desk. It was a detailed map of Glacier National Park. A dozen dots were marked on it with a red marker. One of these dots was suspiciously close to the spot in the thick of the forest where the Peterson family had found the refrigerator with the body a month and a half earlier. Bradley Cooper was immediately detained. His behavior during the first interrogation only increased suspicions. The man was visibly nervous, sweating, confused in his testimony, and refused to answer questions about his whereabouts in July 2014 without the presence of a lawyer. To the public and the press, who followed the police's every move, Cooper's guilt seemed obvious. A wealthy sadist who went on a manhunt for fun. This story was a perfect fit for the headlines. Detective Ford almost believed that this time they had caught a real beast, but his euphoria was shattered again by the dry facts of forensics and bureaucracy. Cooper's lawyers provided the investigation with evidence that could not be refuted. First, the points on the map that the police took to be the victims' burial sites turned out to be the coordinates of photo traps set to monitor elk migration. Rangers checked these locations and indeed found camouflaged cameras belonging to Cooper. The memory cards showed only animals, no people. Secondly, the examination of the car gave a negative result. Although the color of the Jeep was visually similar, the chemical composition of the paintwork was different from the microparticles on Hector's clothes. In addition, the mechanic who serviced the Cooper family's fleet of vehicles provided documents confirming that in July 2014, the Jeep was in the shop with the transmission removed. It was physically incapable of leaving the estate. And finally, the alibi. The lawyers provided videos and photographs from Bradley's sister's wedding, which took place in Seattle the week the couple disappeared. Hundreds of images showed Bradley Cooper smiling, dancing, and toasting 500 miles away from the crime scene. His nervousness during the interrogation was explained in a trivial way. He hid the fact of an affair with his bridesmaid during that trip from his wife and was afraid that the police would make these details public. Bradley Cooper had to be released. The second suspect, who seemed to be the perfect candidate for the role of the killer, turned out to be another patsy. The investigation reached a dead end for the second time. The sheriff's office fell silent again, heavier than before. It seemed as if the forest was mocking the detectives, throwing them false trails. The hope of finding the killer was melting away with each passing day, and no one even suspected that the end of this drama was approaching. But it would come not because of the work of brilliant investigators, but because of a senseless accident on the night road. 2 months have passed since the discovery of Hector Bell's body. The investigation, which had been full of hope for a quick solution to the crime back in August, began to gradually lose momentum. High-profile raids on suspects' homes proved fruitless. DNA tests yielded no matches, and thousands of pages of reports brought detectives no closer to answering the main question: who was behind this horror? The residents of Flathead County began to return to their normal lives, resigned to the idea that the killer had probably left the state long ago, or had gone underground so deeply that it was impossible to find him. However, the end of this drama came not as a result of the brilliant work of profilers or an FBI sting operation, but because of a banal traffic violation on an empty night street. On September 14, 2015, at 2:15 in the morning, Patrol Officer Daniel Evans was on duty in the southern sector of the city of Kalispell. The night was calm. The airwaves were silent. Evans was slowly walking down Main Street when an old white Chevy Express van ahead of him caught his eye. The vehicle looked neglected. There were traces of rust and putty on the body, and one of the taillights was out of order. At the intersection with Idaho Street, the traffic light changed to red. The van driver did not even try to slow down. The vehicle flew through the intersection on a stop signal, nearly hitting the curb as it turned. Officer Evans immediately activated his flashing lights and siren. The van traveled about 100 yards more before it awkwardly pulled to the side of the road and stopped. As the officer approached the driver's door, the window rolled down, and the pungent smell of cheap whiskey and tobacco hit the officer's nose. Behind the wheel was 42-year-old Clive Miller, an unremarkable man with a tired face, dressed in a dirty work jacket. He worked as a handyman and appliance installer, servicing homes all over the county. Miller was so drunk that he could barely string 2 words together. His eyes were glassy, and his movements were sluggish. There was no point in performing a sobriety test. The driver's condition was obvious. Evans handcuffed Miller, read him his rights, and put him in the back of the patrol car. Since the driver was detained and the car was creating an obstacle on the road, the instructions required that a tow truck be called and the vehicle taken to the impound lot. Before doing so, however, the officer was required to take a full inventory of the property inside the car to avoid possible claims of theft of valuables. Evans reluctantly took out a report form and a flashlight. The interior of the van resembled a garbage dump. Empty beer bottles, fast food wrappers, and crumpled newspapers were lying underfoot. The back seat was littered with tools, drills, coils of wire, boxes of nuts and bolts. The officer methodically wrote down each item he found. A set of screwdrivers, 1 piece, a construction hammer, 1 piece, a roll of electrical tape. While pushing apart the piles of junk in the back seat, the flashlight beam caught a black object lying between a pizza box and an old jack. It was a Nikon digital SLR camera. It looked quite expensive against the general clutter in the cabin. Evans picked up the camera to find the serial number for the record. The device was on, and the battery was still holding a charge. The officer pressed the image view button to make sure the camera was working and possibly identify the owner if it was a stolen item. A photo appeared on the small liquid crystal screen. It was not a snapshot of a construction site or a family photo of Miller. The shot, apparently taken from some distance and through the branches of trees, showed a green tourist tent. Two young men were sleeping on the grass near the entrance. The man's face was turned to the side, but the girl's profile was clear. Officer Evans's heart skipped a beat. He, like every police officer in the state of Montana, had seen that face hundreds of times over the past year. It had stared back at him from the bulletin boards in the department, from the flyers in store windows, from the TV screens. It was Ella Reynolds. The photo looked as if it had been taken by a stalker watching his victims in the moments before the attack. With trembling fingers, Evans pressed the next frame button. What he saw next made his stomach clench. Another photo of Ella appeared on the screen, but this time, she was no longer sleeping in nature. The girl was sitting on a dirt floor in a dimly lit room with gray concrete walls. Her hands were tied together with plastic ties, her eyes were wide with terror, and her clothes were dirty and torn. But the most frightening thing about this picture was the date that the camera automatically dropped into the lower right corner of the frame. The numbers glowed bright orange. August 15th, 2014. Officer Evans did some mental math. The couple had disappeared on July 10th. The official search operation was completed on July 25th. This photo proved the impossible. A month after the entire state had buried them in their imaginations, Ella Reynolds was still alive and in captivity. Evans slowly lowered the camera. He looked over his shoulder at his patrol car. In the darkness, the silhouette of Clive Miller could be seen behind the bars of the rear window. The man slept with his head against the glass, his mouth half open. He was no genius of the underworld, no elusive ghost sought by the country's best agents. He was just a drunk driver who was too lazy to throw away or hide the most important evidence of his crime, throwing it among the boxes of trash. Officer Evans took out his radio. His voice trembled as he called the dispatcher, not out of fear, but out of the realization of who was sitting in his car right now. He didn't just ask for a tow truck. He asked for an on-call detective and backup. That night, Clive Miller sobered up not from coffee, but from the cold realization that his red light at the intersection was the end of his secret life. However, the main question remained open. Where was the second photo taken, and what did it hide behind its concrete borders? Clive Miller's interrogation began at 3 a.m. on September 15, 2015. The atmosphere in the sheriff's office interrogation room was oppressive. Detective Harrison Ford, who had been working on the case for more than a year, placed only one item on the metal table: the Nikon digital camera found in the detainee's van. Miller, who had already sobered up a bit and began to realize his situation, took one look at the device and turned pale. He didn't need lawyers or lengthy persuasion. Under the weight of the irrefutable evidence, his defense crumbled instantly. Miller's confession shocked the investigators not with the complexity of the criminal plan, but with its absolute sickening primitiveness. He was no genius of the criminal world, no vengeful maniac with childhood traumas. He was just a simple man who turned into a monster through a combination of alcohol, permissiveness, and instant desire. According to Clive, it all started by accident. On that morning, July 10, 2014, he also stopped by the North Valley Auto Service Center to buy oil for his old van. There he saw Ella Reynolds laughing at the vending machine. Miller admitted that he liked her. When the couple drove away, he impulsively followed their silver Toyota. He followed them for more than an hour on North Fork Road. As Ella and Hector parked at Kintla Lake and began to pack up their belongings, Miller drove up close. He got out of the car, holding an old .38 caliber revolver in his pocket. At gunpoint, he forced the couple into his van. Hector Bell tried to resist when Miller ordered Ella to be tied up. This was the architect's death sentence. Clive hit him on the back of the head with the handle of his gun, and then, in a fit of rage, strangled him with a piece of tow rope. The explanation for the refrigerator was as banal as it was horrifying. Miller worked as a home appliance installer and often took old appliances for recycling. On that day, he had an old frost guard in the back of his van, which he had picked up from a customer. The criminal planned to sell it for scrap or take it to a landfill, but there was a $10 fee to pay. In order to save the $10 and get rid of the body, he stuffed Hector inside, drove him into the middle of the forest along an old logging road, and dumped him there. Later, in August, he returned to the crime scene to put a lock and chain on the body, and that's when he dropped the gum wrapper he had bought on the way. But the scariest part of the story concerned Ella. Miller brought her to his house in the quiet suburb of Kalispell. None of the neighbors noticed that he was bringing a large bundle of carpet into the garage. Ella spent the last months of her life in a soundproofed basement that Miller had built himself. As a professional builder, he knew how to make sure that no sound escaped. The girl lived in this concrete bag for almost 3 months. Miller claimed to have fed her, but the conditions were inhumane. Dampness, cold, and constant stress did their job. In October 2014, Ella fell ill. Miller did not give her any medication, afraid to go to the pharmacy or doctors. She died of pneumonia and complete exhaustion in mid-October, quietly fading away on a dirty mattress. After receiving the confession, the police immediately went to Miller's residence. The house looked ordinary: a well-kept lawn, a child's bike in the neighboring yard, and the silence of a residential neighborhood. The investigators entered the garage, which was filled with boxes and tools. Miller pointed to a section of concrete floor near a workbench, where the concrete looked slightly lighter than the rest of the flooring. It took the forensics team 4 hours of jackhammering to solve the mystery. At a depth of 6 feet, under a layer of concrete and construction debris, they found the remains of Ella Reynolds. Her body was wrapped in plastic wrap. Forensics would later confirm the identity of the deceased and the cause of death, which was named by the killer. The news of Clive Miller's arrest caused a real shock among the Montana public. People were ready to accept the version of a maniacal forest hermit or a rich pervert who goes on a manhunt. These images fit the stereotypes of horror movies. But the reality was much more terrifying. The killer was an invisible man, a quiet, polite handyman who had been entering the homes of hundreds of families for years to fix washing machines or adjust refrigerators. His neighbors described him as a friendly man who always said hello and helped shovel snow. No one could believe that while they were barbecuing in the backyard, just a few yards away, in a soundproofed basement, the girl the entire state was searching for was slowly dying. The case of Glacier's cold silence was officially closed. Clive Miller received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. But for the Reynolds and Bell family, as well as for the entire community, this did not bring relief. Ella and Hector's story was a brutal reminder that real evil is not always hidden in dark forests or abandoned huts. Sometimes it lives in the neighborhood, drives an old van to work and stops at red lights, hiding an abyss of darkness behind its ordinary appearance.